So what am I going to talk about? I'm going to talk about including environmental justice in natural resource damage assessment. But many of the things that I'm going to discuss here, some of the policy issues and the technical issues, also apply to other kinds of environmental policy decisions, like climate resiliency planning and climate change in general. So while my talk will be about NRDA, I will point out along the way other places where this appears. So what I would like to do is talk first about the several ways that we might include EJ in NRDA. And we've heard a fair amount about this. We've heard a lot about meaningful engagement. And I think we've heard also about changing priorities and looking for cases and front-loading cases where environmental justice is an issue, where disadvantaged communities are been harmed, and sort of taking those first. I'll talk about this as sort of procedural things that can be done within the NRDA process of, what cases do you take and who do you listen to, and listening closely as extremely meaningful and extremely important. But I'd say they're necessary but not sufficient for the outcome of the process, the restoration, to actually address inequities. I mean, you have an opportunity to be heard, but it's not necessarily the case that the outcomes reflect justice concerns. Secondly, I'm going to talk about methods that are, I'd say, substantive but informal. So you may, I think this is what John was talking about, John Cruden, when he was talking about, there's a big art associated with doing damage assessment cases. And there's a lot of leeway for being artful. And so I would sort of talk about that as it's substantive. You are going to choose restoration in a particular way to address concerns for a lot of different things, including environmental justice. But formally, you're going to kind of do the same old thing. You're not going to actually change your formal methods. So you're not going to change HEA or RIA or recreation analyses, but you're going to get the results, and then you're going to use those monies in some way. And I think that that's a useful idea. But what I want to talk about is, and I'll talk about substantive but informal. I want to spend also time talking about substantive and formal. So you're actually building environmental justice considerations and fairness considerations into your scaling methods. I'm going to talk about this in quite a narrow way. This is a gigantic field of how you build equity into environmental policy analysis that's been developed by economists and philosophers and all sorts of folks. I'm going to talk about methods that are as close as possible to current practice. So it's taking what we do, recreation demand models, benefits transfers, HEAs and RIAs, and tweaking them, if you will, to be able to accommodate. What we find is, in this case, that restoration might both compensate the public, which is the fundamental thing that restoration needs to do, but also promote fairness and justice by effectuating a transfer from relatively resource rich to the relatively resource poor. And so you can build that in potentially to how you go about your business. So I'm going to do this in a super simple model where it's the simplest case you can imagine. Injury starts at the beginning of the first period. It's constant. You jump back to baseline. Then you're put in place restoration. That goes for a period and it evaporates, and there's no discount rate. I'll come back and talk about discount rate issues later. But there's the time path of your injuries. They start out, you're at baseline, they drop down, they're constant a period, they go back to baseline, you put in place restoration, and that lasts a period. This gets rid of all these complications, so we can kind of see clearly through to what the real issues are here. So I'm going to talk about a little tinker toy model of NRDA. So we have 5 communities, and they vary in the amount of resource that they have. This is some index. We'll talk about it as acres of resource, but it's not necessarily acres. But they have relative advantage or disadvantage in the space of the amount of resources that they have available to them. And I'm going to put numbers on those across the top that are, really complex numbers. And then I'm going to think about, well, what does those acres mean for these different communities? And I'm going to map that into some idea of well-being. And if you're looking really carefully and you're not too tired at the end of the day, you can see that this was a pretty simple mapping. I multiplied by 2. It's a linear mapping. And we'll come back to this topic, but it's an important issue of how do you move from a notion of something you'd measure on the ground to a notion of the well-being of the people who have access to that amount of stuff on the ground. And that's a fundamental issue that, that will drive a lot of this discussion. So what does this even mean? How can it be measured? Come back to that later. So now imagine community 4 over here suffers an injury. It goes from 20 down to 5, and its well-being drops from 60 to 45. And the issue is, what are you going to do about that? Where are you going to put the restoration? How appropriate? What is the appropriate scale? And what's its effect on inequality? So Mark pointed out that the issue was, what do you do? Where do you put it? And how much do you do? So these are the exact same questions as Mark was addressing. All of these are matters of ethics. I will, at my peril, disagree a little bit with John Gruden, where he said in the NRDA statutes, there's really no way to address environmental justice. It kind of has to be on the side as something that you're going to do as a matter of art. It's not really in the technical aspects of it. And I disagree. I think that in the NRDA statutes, there's plenty of ethics running around. There's plenty of leeway for undertaking computations. There are general principles, but there's a lot of room in how you do it. And that there's capability to embody different ethics into those computations. And that's exactly what I'm going to talk about. So let's talk about this substantive but informal approach. It comes through restoration project selection criteria. So one is you have to compensate the public. I'm going to call that PC. So that is a fundamental goal of restoration. A second one is nexus. 2 kinds of nexus: service nexus, providing similar services to those injured. So Mark talked about this a little bit. If you injure some sediments or a wetland and you wish to do some restoration, how much leeway is there to put in a park versus sediments? So that's kind of what services are you supplying. But there's also what I call a people nexus. Restoring the same people as those injured could be a goal. And we actually see both sort of service and geography applied in NRDA cases. Another one's cost effectiveness. If you have 2 projects that meet the same set of goals, pick the cheaper one. And I would say we could add, formally or informally, environmental justice in 2 forms. One, EJ1, do your project, but make sure you don't increase baseline inequality. If you're meeting that goal, doing better on inequality is irrelevant. It's kind of a threshold. You want to come back to the baseline level of inequality. EJ2 would be more active, and you actually seek to reduce inequality with the structure design of your program, of your restoration project. So how would you measure inequality? I'm not going to go into this much. A whole lot of different approaches have been devised, and they're sort of axiomatic in the way that they work. And what do I mean by that? So you set out desirable properties of a measure. that you just justify ethically, that it just makes sense to have a measure that has those features. And then you find a formula that meets the specification. So I'll show you that a little bit later. But here are some examples of an axiom that you might imply. If you change the scale from feet to meters, then you really shouldn't change the outcome of your conclusions about equity. That seems kind of sensible. If you switch two people, inequality doesn't change. So if you take everybody's array and you just switch two people, you have the same distribution, it shouldn't respond, your inequality measure shouldn't be changed. Well, now that one's a little trickier. So you know, we have the old saying, you give a man a fish. You give a man a fish, you give a quadriplegic a bicycle. Maybe that's not the same as giving the man who could eat the fish the bicycle and the fish to the quadriplegic. So that doesn't satisfy anonymity, but it goes to the capability of the person who has an amount of a resource, a bicycle versus not, to turn that into well-being. So this mapping between what do you have and how off you are raises some really serious questions about how you go about that. So, you know, this is not for the faint of heart to begin to think about different ways to measure inequality and what does that mean and how do we want to do it. Another way, you know, another axiom would be if you had a balanced transfer from the rich to the poor, that should reduce inequality. And if we set aside questions and we impose of who these people are and what history they might have had about how they got to where they are, then and you impose anonymity, then certainly this balanced transfer makes some sense. So you could write down a whole bunch of these axioms and then say, well, if those are the ones we're going to go with, then we get a particular function that embodies inequality. And we'll see one of those later. So when is satisfying the public, compensating the public satisfied? The traditional way to do this is value-to-value scaling. And I'll come back and talk about HIA, but it is a special case. It was developed by economists. It's a special case of value-to-value scaling. So in principle, we're kind of with HIA and ARIA here, but we'll talk more specifically about that in a minute. So you measure this well-being as willingness to pay. How much money would you give up to be in one circumstance versus another? And you say a project satisfies PC, you've compensated the public, if the positive willingness to pay to obtain this restoration is at least as great as the negative willingness to pay or the willingness to accept to endure the harm. And so it's kind of a very simple additive approach to determining when you have compensated the public. Basically, it says that the sum of the willingness to pay of everybody who's harmed and anybody who's winning from this restoration project is non-negative. And I'm going to put in a 1 over n and say that's an average. And we're going to come back later to environmental justice and see a different form of averaging. So we're going to modify a little bit this traditional approach to have a modified average that incorporates justice. And this is kind of a hypothetical test. Could those who benefited from restoration pay those who are injured to endure the harm and have something left over? And if yes, then you pass this test for whether you've compensated the public as a whole. So if people are different, they may disagree on the amount of restoration or what gets restored. Your consultation process doesn't necessarily result in unanimity. Some people are going to be disappointed. Some people will be overjoyed. How do you determine whether as a whole the public was compensated? This is the traditional method. And noteworthy is that when you measure those dollars of willingness to pay or willingness to accept, they're the same no matter who they come from. So that is part of the traditional approach. And that's what we do in NRDA, every single NRDA. So a lot of projects will pass this test. For example, if a project passes it, so would a bigger version. You can put projects in different communities and scale them. So you need other criteria to get through to a final selection. So one other criterion would be nexus. Put the restoration in the community harmed. All right, that's a good idea. It's done a lot. You would reestablish the original distribution. This would satisfy EJ1. That is, make sure that you put back what was there. So nexus would accomplish that goal. Another one is cost effective. No matter where you put it, don't make it bigger than necessary, and put it where restoration costs are low. So why might you want to do that? So here we have the same picture that we had before. And here are the costs per acre. And they're low over here because you got a lot of places where you could do restoration. Over here, not so many. So that might be more costly. They don't necessarily have to go in this order, but it's not implausible that they would. So suppose it said nexus. I'm going to put it back in community 4. 5 acres. It's going to cost you $100. If instead you put it down there in community 1, you could scale it to satisfy public compensation. It satisfies environmental justice too. You put it in the worst off community. You spend $5 there. You can give $45 to community 4 and they're as well off as they would have been. That's how much they lost in well-being. And then you have $50 left over to spend on everybody. So everybody could be made better off. So cost effectiveness is a pretty compelling idea. If you violate it, you're implicitly destroying resources. So cost effectiveness is something you might want to think about. So these criteria can conflict with one another. And what I want to say here is that the conclusions that I drew they ain't necessarily so, because it depended on the way I set it up. Maybe the costs are not smaller in the resource poor community. Maybe it's less costly in more resource rich community. So cost effectiveness says, put it over there with the rich folks. They're just happen to be cheap. Well, then that would conflict with EJ. Both of those might conflict with nexus. So if you put it in community 1 and the cost there was the greatest, then those conflict. So I guess my take home message is that these criteria can conflict. So it's not a slam dunk how you go about your business. It's part of the art of doing NRDA. And I also assumed that this willingness to pay is linear in relation to acres. Well, when you go out and you do an empirical model that relates willingness to pay or value or well-being measures to the amount of resources people have, it can go any which way. So the traditional analysis can look like the middle, which is the one that I assumed, a linear relationship between how many acres you have and willingness to pay. But it can go up or it could go that way, and those have very different implications for justice. And I'll allow you to come back and ponder that. So my take-home message in this section is traditional NRDA approach to scaling has implications for equity of outcomes that may not be fully recognized. There may be, going back to this, if it happened that it looked on the right or on the left instead of the middle, you would have different outcomes. And they have different justice implications. So it's sort of an unintended consequence what situation you're going to come up. We ought to be intentional about that. And not just kind of willy-nilly do stuff and find out that we have some outcome on environmental justice in our scaling. We should actually think carefully. Second thing is that considering fairness and outcomes can be in conflict with existing criteria for project selection or not. Those can align, they might conflict. It depends on the circumstances. Finally, the informal approach may introduce a mismatch. And it may introduce a mismatch between what you assumed about a project when you were scaling it So if you did a traditional scaling, you may assume a particular kind of project in a particular location. And then if you come along after the fact and you do something different in your artful implementation of spending a given amount of money, you put it somewhere else, then you have a mismatch between what you assumed when you scaled and what you actually did with the money. And that can lead to biased estimates of NRDs. And, you know, I work for industrial clients, PRPs typically. And one of the things that they always ask me at the highest levels in the decision-making parts of these firms is, why is that the right amount? I'll pay my fair share, but I need to know why it's that much money instead of some other amount of money. So I have to explain this to them to get, you know, negotiations authority. And if there's a biased method, then they're skeptical about this. So that's part of my job, is to explain why it is that a given amount is what they're facing. So that leads to doing this in a substantive and more formal way. So if there was an environmental justice concern expressed, and I and my client showed up at one of the first meetings, and the trustees said, we really want to consider environmental justice in this project. And we say, that's great, we're all on board. It fits with a lot of objectives of a lot of my clients interested in corporate social responsibility and environmental social governance. But then the question is, how are you going to do that? And if the answer is we have no idea, we're just going to do it artfully, then there's some skepticism on the part of my client. So is there a way to do this formally? And I am going to forward something that, well, it's a little bit of a be careful what you wish for moment. You know, if I had said caveats at the beginning of this, certainly my clients are not endorsing what I'm doing here. I'm speaking for myself. My animals wouldn't necessarily endorse this. You know, I'm not talking about justice outcomes for non-human beings, so they would definitely snort at this. And I'm not even sure necessarily that I'm arguing that what I'm about to talk about should be done in all cases. But like HIA and RIA, which are highly simplified models, they perform a valuable framework function, a structure, and a language for talking about the issues and understanding them and negotiating them within a structure. So if we're going to talk about environmental justice, let's do it within a structure and a framework where we kind of know what we're talking about. So that's the spirit in which I am forwarding this. So remember when we said there's a mapping from acres to well-being? Let's do that. And you remember that there was this traditional approach of deciding when the public was compensated, which had an average of unweighted willingness to pay. That is, in a sense, an index of social welfare associated, it's an ethical judgment, associated with how we aggregate. If two people disagree, how do we resolve the conflict technically and conclude that the public as a whole has been compensated? So I'm going to come up with a formula that is an index of social welfare, and it's going to exhibit this notion that a balanced transfer increases social welfare. So if I take something from the rich and I give it to the poor, and I make a switch and a transfer, and it balances out, so the mean of everything we have is not worse, that's better. And if I use this index for scaling instead of the sum of the unweighted willingness to pay, I'm now not doing value to value scaling, I'm doing social value to social value scaling. So here's the approach. This formula says, let's take the sum, and I have some mapping here from acres into well-being. And in my other one, it was linear. It was like that middle figure where it was a straight line. And I'm going to say that this, instead of being a straight line or one going the other way, which is convex, it's going to be concave, which exhibits an aversion to inequality. All right. Now, at this point, I'm going to take a little bit of a timeout on this picture and say, so this mapping between acres and social welfare is curved so that the increase in well-being, as you have more and more and more, the increments diminish. So the incremental well-being goes down. Let me also say that I could put, let's talk about climate change momentarily. I could put time on this axis. And here we have the future. If the future is better off than the present, if the present was this disadvantaged generation, and the future was an advantaged, as a subscript A for advantaged generation, then this same curve might apply. I'm inverse to inequality across generations. So that's where the discount rate comes from. So this picture is the same thing as talking about inequality in a climate change circumstance, where if the future is rich, we want to take account of the relative well-offness of the future compared to the present. But if things are degrading and the resource base is being harmed over time, then this is the current generation is advantaged and the future is impoverished, and we're moving the other way. So the same kinds of considerations that are going to come into this social welfare function also come in across people at one time, also could come in across different generations. So I'm suddenly talking about climate change, which I promised. So how does this handle this social value to social value scaling? Well, suppose we have some injury in the injured community, I says injured, and that they were relatively advantaged. So like community 4, that had pretty much acres, it was relatively advantaged, and it lost a given amount, and that gave we read off, they started here with this much welfare, and they ended up here with this much welfare. So they had a change in welfare. Let me equate that to restoration benefits in a disadvantaged community. My restored community R, and it's relatively disadvantaged to begin with. It starts at the lower line and it moves out, and we get the same amount of welfare change. So this is scaled. The change in welfare from the injury is equal to the change in welfare here, but the amount of restoration is much smaller. It seems counterintuitive. I really care about justice. And so I am going to take this big injury and I'm going to compensate it with a small amount of compensation. Well, that seems counterintuitive, but it's really not when you think it through. This is part of the value of mathematics, is it can lead you to unexpected things that are kind of counter to your intuition. Why is that? Well, because you value giving an acre to people who are disadvantaged regarding the number of acres that they have. So you put more weight there, so you don't have to do as many acres to get the same social welfare bang for your acre buck. So when you put in that you are adverse to inequality, it has this implication for how you scale. This would have the same implication as it over time. If we are giving to the future and the future is going to be impoverished, we don't have to pass it along as much. The rate of return on savings doesn't have to be as great. This is like a low discount rate. If it goes the other way and we're starting impoverished and we're giving to a rich future, then each unit that we give the future is not worth very much because they already have a lot. And so you have to give them more to get the same bang for your buck. You need a lot of return on your investment. This is like a high discount rate. So this is why I love economics. You kind of are led to these conclusions by the force of the logic that you might not have guessed ahead of time. So let's do, I'm almost over, a particular form for this. This is well used form. It's called the Atkinson Form, where the mapping between the acres and well-being is a function of the number of acres. It's not linear. And you put it into not a regular average, but a generalized average. And this parameter epsilon is a measure of how curvy that curve was that I just looked at. It's talking about, it is a parameter for how much you are averse to inequality. So if that epsilon goes up, the curve is curvier. So you have a greater aversion to inequality. So having that in hand, you can begin to ask, well, how could we actually implement this? And you could implement this in a recreation situation very simply compared to what you do now. You just use an approach called equivalent income. It's very close to willingness to pay. It does a couple of other things. It would use the same data, use the same logic as willingness to pay, but it makes the measures comparable across people so you can add them up in a way that willingness to pay does not. When you're talking about RIA and HIA and not doing a valuation approach, it's much more complicated. And I'm just going to touch on it as briefly as could be, but I kind of dreamed up this approach called RIA equivalent utility. I'll spend 1 minute on it. It's I have a couple papers where you can read and think this through a little bit more if you wish. So here's the RIA equivalent utility. I got two people with different preferences ranking two projects, X and Y. All right. So person A here, this is a locus of all the projects, all the combinations of two services, two different kinds of services that the different project would emphasize. So project Y is more geared to service 1 and less to project 2, and project X is more geared to 2 and less of project 1. And this line here, this curve, is person A's, all the ones that I would judge as equivalent to Y. All right, it's called an indifference curve. And there's the indifference curve through X for person A, and they prefer X to Y. X is on a higher indifference curve. And so person A definitely likes X over Y. So now let me put in person B here, which is got different preferences. Person B prefers Y to X. So just based on that, one person likes one better than another, and but there's no way to add these up. There's no way to say if I did X, society is better off than if I did Y. It's just not possible, and that doesn't even come up in habitat and resource equivalency analysis. They need to assume that everybody's the same, that everybody agrees on restoration. There's no information about people and their preferences in HIAs and RIAs. So almost by definition, you can't do environmental justice in a RIA and a HIA because you can't solve the problem in front of us on the screen. I've got a HIA, the habitats providing do different services. I can do restoration that favors one or the other. One favors fish and the other birds. One favors groundwater, the other surface water, or there's different choices that you can make in restoration design, and I can't rank them. I can't even say who's better or worse off than the other person. So I don't have any way to justify which project I choose. So I thought, well, why don't we do something that looks like a RIA, where here is the baseline amount. This is the baseline service combination in the habitat. And imagine that you can just blow that baseline up by doing more acres. So if I did very few acres, I'd be along this RIA line to the bottom. And this is RIA because all the services move in the same proportion to the amount of the resource, which in this case is acres. So if I have few acres, I'm down towards the origin. If I have a lot of acres, I'm out here to the right. And now I can ask, well, what are you indifferent to in terms of X and Y if you're A and B, to instead of these different projects, one that rescales the baseline combination just using acres. And what you'd find is, well, person A would find this number of acres, person A, project Y, indifferent to project Y. So this RIA project is just as good as this HIA project Y. Person B for project X, person B for project Y, person A for project X, moving out this RIA curve. Now we have a way to say who's better off under which project and by how much. So you can actually measure well-being this way and stick it into a welfare formula. And there are formulas that satisfy a transfer, so that if I transferred resources from one person to another, I am better off. And so you come up with a formula that represents this. So I've got some papers on this that that are on our website that talk about this in more detail if you're confused, which you have every right to be. My take-home message is, so if you're going to implement these scalings and formally build in EJ, you have to, first of all, measure outcomes so that they can be compared across people in some way. You have to do that if people disagree, if you're going to say whether the public is as a whole better or worse off with project one, X versus project Y. You have to be able to add that up in some way. Ethical considerations cannot be excised from how this is done. But ethical considerations cannot be exercised by how we do it anyway. So whenever we do a NRDA, we're doing a ton of ethics, and I'm arguing that however we do this, we should think carefully about it. Another take-home message is including EJ requires additional information beyond what we currently collect, especially for HIAs and RIAs. But there are tools for doing this. I would argue with John, again at my peril, that this is consistent with what's in the regulations. It talks about valuation. It doesn't talk about aggregation, but you have to do it. It talks about HIAs and RIAs. How you implement them is not entirely spelled out. So within the toolkit, which is admissible, I would say we could do these things if we chose. I'm not arguing that we should do this in every case, but there they are. I talked about this already. This justice over time is exactly what I just talked about, but now it's embodied in the discount rate. So here are two papers. One talks about doing what I just talked about in the context of recreation, where there are values. It would also apply potentially to tribal issues where there are cultural uses. Wherever there's a use, the kinds of methods would apply. And then the second paper talks about this in terms of HIAs and RIAs, this idea of RIA equivalent utility as a way to undertake going about our business. Those are now on the web page as of this afternoon. And you can get to them with this link. And if you have any questions or comments or concerns or want to send me some invective message or a message full of invective, you can do that at Ted Tomasi at integral.corp-corp.com.